Buenas tardes, bienvenidos.
Good evening here. Welcome to the Forum of Culture 2020. Today we start this fourth edition of the forum under the motto From the Shelter. It will be about climate change and the environment, and the pandemic, of course, will be shaping, no doubt, this 22 forum, because we'll be switching between two modalities. On the one hand, online conversations and face-to-face conversations. The Culture Forum will start today and will take place until November the 15th. Today, it's the first conversation. Online conversations will be taking place from here to Thursday, and from then on, we'll have the face-to-face event in Burgos, of course, complying with all safety measures. In order to get the whole thing kicked off or started, we decided to address the fundamental topic that is being discussed on an international scale these days, and which monopolizes all news this year, which is no other than the COVID-19 pandemic, under the title COVID-19 and Climate Change Towards an Ecology of the Disease. Will try to address the relations of human beings with nature and how those interactions have an impact on the generation of viruses and in the easy or quick spread of them. In order for us to have this first conversation, we've invited journalist and novelist, Norwegian writer Lars Mytting, the author of Solid Wood, really a literary revolution, an international phenomenon, which has engaged many readers to reflect on the connections between human beings and nature. Good evening or good afternoon, Lars. Welcome to this Culture Forum.
Thank you. Thank you.
Junto con Lars tenemos...
Together with Lars, we also are lucky to have Carl Zimmer with us here today, scientist, a popularizer of scientists, renowned New York Times columnist, and a man with many publications, 14 books, including a Planet of Virus, which opens up our eyes to the biological reality of our connection with viruses. We live with them. We are part of our nature. Welcome, Carl.
Thanks for having me.
So if you are agree, we may start on this talk about the connection between COVID-19 and climate change. Over the last few months, we've talked about so many things that have to do with the virus, with coronavirus. We've talked a lot about the origin of that virus. There was talk about pangolins, bats. There was talk about these conspirational theories that suggest that these are laboratory viruses. But perhaps one thing that's not being addressed so much is the cause of this virus, so to speak. Mr. Zimmer, there's always in the development of any virus, of microorganisms, of parasites, there's always this connection with human beings, and also a connection basically in the form of human beings and human beings' connection with nature. The interface with nature, the way we relate to nature, sometimes disturb nature. So I wonder if we can consider that this pandemic is, in a way, nature telling us, maybe a slap from nature on human selfishness, a reaction by nature.
Well, I wouldn't anthropomorphize nature that way. I mean, I think we just need to understand the natural world, and we need to understand how we are a part of it. If you look at the emerging diseases that are of most concern to medical experts, 70% of them come from other animals. We know where they came from. Their origin was a transition. They jumped from one species to us. And all of the pandemics that we're dealing with, not just COVID, but pandemic influenza and so on, these come from animals as well. This is nothing new in the sense that livestock and wildlife have been the source of many viruses for thousands of years, but it's quite clear that it is accelerating. You can see that there are more and more of these emerging diseases, several new ones every year that we're finding, so we need to we need to understand what activities that we are doing are leading to that acceleration, and it is in our control to reduce this threat. And it's actually, it would not be very expensive to do it compared to the incredible cost that we're dealing with this just one pandemic right now.
Tenemos que entender esa relación con la
So
naturaleza.
perhaps we need to understand that relationship with nature and to come to terms with the fact that interactions between humans and nature have their consequences. Mr. Mytting, you've quite often said that human beings tend to see nature as kind of a thematic or recreational park.
Okay.
So it's about how we organize ourselves, how we relate to nature correctly, and we need to be critical towards some of the behaviors that we tend to show.
Well, again, I believe that a good, healthy connection to nature is vital to all humans, because with a close interaction, we can see how our behavior directly affects it. Not only on an environmental scale, but on participating with the way things grow and to harvest from nature, simply. And what I often said is that we would be more healthy as humans, not only in the traditional way of looking at health, but in our mindset. If we were closer to nature and could see how I have a bit of trouble finding the proper English words for it. But for example, to see how mankind is a part of the shifting seasons, and to learn that everything in nature has its cycles and its natural changes. I think people some generations ago were closer to observing that, and perhaps also took the events that we today look upon as great disasters with more with, say, a more calm attitude.
Comentaba antes el señor Zimmer que
Carl Zimmer was saying earlier that pandemics derive most of the times from an animal source, and in this particular case, and as happened with others, scientists were expecting for some time for this kind of pandemic to touch us, to get us. There were warnings, in other words. It's not something that was a surprise for scientists. But perhaps we would not prepare for that. We didn't take the trouble to prepare ourselves to prevent this situation. Perhaps at one point we thought ourselves invincible or alien to nature's workings as human beings. But perhaps that's why.
It is true that scientists have been telling us about these sorts of pandemics for quite a while now. This is not the part of the tragedy is this is not a surprise. I, as a journalist, I was writing articles about this over 20 years ago, but I was not breaking a news story. There have been scientists who have been talking about these issues since the 1990s. I think that the clearest example of it was with HIV, because there you had a virus that seemed to come out of nowhere in the 1980s. Suddenly in Los Angeles, there were a few people who had a virus that no one had seen before and was causing a disease that had never been seen before, at least to modern medicine. And so there were lots of conspiracy theories like we see sometimes now with coronavirus. People can't believe that a new virus can spread over the world and kill millions of people. They refuse to believe it, that it could happen through an unguided process. So there must be some evil genius somewhere who must have done it. So people had theories that HIV was created by the Central Intelligence Agency and so on. It took many years for it to really establish exactly what happened. And the fact was that HIV had originated almost a century earlier, in the early 1900s. By combining clues, it was possible to see that it was it came about through in the earliest stages of sort of modern colonial industrialization of the wilderness, in the sense of in Central Africa, you were starting to have railroads and large-scale lumber operations, pulling wood out of the forests. And there were chimpanzees and monkeys there that had a virus, and people who were hunting for them would sometimes acquire the virus, probably the way they had for centuries, but there wasn't a network to connect them to a global world the way that there was in the early 1900s. And so, if we had just been paying attention, perhaps we would have been aware of this 100 years ago, that this had happened. And HIV, would go on to kill tens of millions of people. Our problematic relationship with nature, it did not begin in 2020. The origin of HIV is a great example of how disruptions to nature can lead to global human pandemics, and that happened, in the early 20th century. So again and again, if we pay attention, we can see this threat. But I think that there are, in many countries, there have been great medical advances that make us less concerned about diseases. So in the United States, for example, my grandparents' generation were terrified of polio. Every summer, there would be children who would become paralyzed or die because of polio. In the United States, it started around 1916. And then year after year after year, there was terror. Then we had a polio vaccine, which essentially eradicated it. There are some people alive today who are, bear the scars of polio, but, we sort of forget it. And so then we feel like, well, it's not a big deal. Nothing like that could happen. And then people also say like, oh, and I don't even need a vaccine. I don't see polio. I don't see diphtheria. What do I need a vaccine for? So, if we can have that sort of awareness beyond our immediate senses, both of the invisible world of viruses and our relationship with nature, I think we would be healthier.
Hablaba precisamente de que todos los avances tecnológicos nos han...
You've mentioned that all of these technological advances sometimes have made us forget about what happened to us, and think that the certainty that technological and medical advances would make us overcome any ailments that may come about. But perhaps what we didn't quite understand is that, with all that technological evolution and economic progress, we're also generating other kinds of problems that may perhaps be even bigger and more complex to handle, and with which we haven't yet the tools to tackle, to control them, and to overcome them.
We do have the tools to control them. There are very straightforward things that we can do. Again, scientists have told us again and again. There was just a report today from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. They just came out with a report just laying out how protecting wildlife and monitoring for new viruses and having systems in place could dramatically reduce the damage from pandemics. So we do know what to do. We have the tools. They're not that expensive. So the estimate that this new report has is that it would be less than $60 billion every year to do this for the world. The United States alone is losing $16 trillion in costs due to this COVID-19. That's one country, $16 trillion. So, you know, for just a few percent of that cost, you could dramatically reduce the risk of these things. Because, you know, we had COVID-19, we will have COVID-25, we will have COVID-30. Scientists have shown us the coronaviruses. We know where they are. They're out in the bats and in other species. They're there, they're waiting. There are lots of other kinds of viruses as well. So, there's something very strange about the fact that we have the tools. Scientists have told us for decades that we need to use them, and we don't want to use them, despite the huge devastation that we see is brought about by not using them.
No sé cuál sería la razón que podríamos.
So what do you think is the reason for people for governments not to use them? Perhaps because we think that we can overcome these situations without resorting to them. Mr. Mytting, what's your take on this?
I just have to say that's not within my field exactly, but for what I can tell is that generally, I suppose, we want to, as Carl pointed out, we want to look at the world as something predictable and tend to believe that problems of the past will not be repeated. If we look at history, we do the same failures again and again and in different shapes. And I believe that there is perhaps a small defect in our view of the future that gives us problems to avoid repeating our failures again and again. I believe that well, every generations are doomed to make their own faults. But again, it's that's not a proper explanation. That would be my explanation as a novelist.
No sé si el señor Zimmer la tiene, esa explicación.
Perhaps Carl Zimmer may have something to add to what Lars said.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, you know, Lars, I actually believe that, you know, novelists can help to show us how we are, you know, the kinds of mistakes that we make or the, you know, alternate futures that we might have, you know, because, you know, it's you know, when the scientists speak, you know, they're very often speaking in very technical terms, very, you know, very dry language, very, you know, they tend to bury the importance of what they're saying because, you know, they can't see the future with total precision. And so, you know, I think sometimes their messages get missed. And you know, I think that in a way, like books and movies are, you know, one of our hopes for getting out of some of these traps. I mean, I don't I don't want to be pessimistic. I don't want to. I mean, there's a lot to be pessimistic about, but I would like there to be ways for us to grapple, you know, with our relationship with nature and with our own, you know, caring for ourselves as a society. We're in a very tragic situation right now. So, you know, we need ways to find to change.
Yes, and we might, I think, consider storytelling as one way of the human survival mechanism. Because if we look at the pattern of some of the oldest stories, and also the pattern of stories that we still today favor. They have a certain pattern that is meant to educate the next generation. If you look at the very old myths, they often follow the pattern of a hero that has to enter the unknown world and face enemies and challenges and make allies and conquer the unknown. But there is one very intriguing part of that pattern that I often like to remind myself about, and that is that these stories, they are never complete until the hero returns home to the cave and can tell the story to his fellow, to his friends or family about what happened. And that's an integral part of that very old storytelling tradition. And that alone, that very small detail tells me that there is a certain mechanism of educating ourselves and the next generation, simply because the story isn't complete until the hero has returned home to give advice to future generations. And I also find it interesting that there is a certain satisfaction to readers and viewers throughout the world of stories that follow this almost non-fiction-like pattern, where you bring your knowledge back to the cave and to the family and your tribe. We see it, for example, in all the Star Wars movies, and we see it in the Lord of the Rings movies. They all follow the pattern of a person going from the unknown and facing trouble, but always returning back to give the lessons. So I believe simply that the storytelling is also part of our way to conquer and to face the problems.
I think that viruses and climate change, these two themes of this meeting, are particularly difficult for storytelling because they're not a big monster that exists in our scale of time and space. Viruses are inconceivably small, and yet can make trillions of copies of themselves inside of our bodies. And there are quadrillions, quintillions of SARS-CoV-2 that have spread in just the past few months around the world. Like it's hard to turn that into a Grendel or some other monster of classic stories. And climate change too it happens. It doesn't happen in a second. It's not like driving off a cliff, but certainly people of our age can remember things when we were children, and things are not like the way they were anymore in a lot of important ways, but it's crept up on us. And so again, it's sort of this intangible thing that seems like it's very challenging for storytelling.
Exactly. They are, as you say, small, creepy, and slow, and don't have a face. So they're not the traditional good enemy to describe at all. But I believe that we've seen a certain change in the way that the newspapers handle it. If we look back on the Spanish flu, the tradition in those days was for newspaper writing, they hardly described the personal disaster of that pandemic. But today, I believe that's for good, that the newspapers and media, they enter more our private sphere. And I believe that one of the reasons that a disaster like the Spanish flu wasn't properly remembered especially in Europe, was simply because the media didn't cover it as the tragedy that it was. Media at that time showed the old man's look on the world, the banks, the world, the banks, the wars, the stock market, that the top of the civilization, but they never showed properly what a private disaster it was. And
That's
I believe
true.
that changed. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was actually just talking with another author recently about, in the United States, there was an election, a presidential election like we're having now, so 1920 instead of 2020. And in 1920, the Spanish flu, the 1918 flu pandemic had just ended, just petered out on its own. And, huge amount of suffering and death in the United States. And I was shocked that, this author had gone back and done a lot of research on what the impact was of the pandemic on that presidential election. And he said they hardly talked about it at all. They were talking about the end of the war, in World War I. They were like looking forward, hoping the economy would get better and so on. But the biggest pandemic that we know of in modern history didn't enter at all into it. And I there was actually like a conscious strategy. The government actually like put pressure on newspapers, just don't write about this much, keep it quiet. And they did, and it just sort of it didn't become an issue. So, and now here we are 100 years later, and I'm just speaking from the United States in another presidential election. This pandemic is the #1 issue. This pandemic, may very well take the current president out of office because of how he has failed to deal with it. It's hard to be, to talk about good things about a new pandemic, but that is an important difference.
Ambos coincidían en señalar que estamos...
I think you both agree that we are in the face of an enemy that is kind of invisible for citizenship, and that makes it more difficult for us to understand where it comes from and the magnitude of its impact. By observing nature closely, we may perhaps understand it better, just as we can understand climate change. And then if we do that, those enemies cease to be so invisible, so intangible. I wonder if you agree that this pandemic, trying to look for the positive side of it, if there is any, will perhaps eventually help us understand or widen our perception on climate change, broaden our mindset, understand that this is out there and that there are a number of risks and that the Earth as a planet is facing. Either of you, if you want to comment on this.
I don't believe really that direct connection between it. But what I do believe is that, and in my view, one of the great threats and one of the direct causes to climate change is the massive consumption that we have, and also the massive travel. And one of the outcomes of this probably will be that we understand that we can live our lives with less airplane travel and also with less consumption. And that thought has been very remote very remote for us, because we are learned or we have been educated from the economic system that we need growth, and that's an integral part of our way of life. But we have actually seen now that we can survive very well with less travel and less growth, and I believe that is perhaps the key lesson from this.
Yeah, I think also I think that people have been really trying to understand what's going on with this pandemic, and we see it at the New York Times where I write. Those of us who write about science, we now are, writing the articles that get, a lot of the readership because people really want to understand how this happened and what is going on now and how we get out of it. And the only way to address those questions is to look at a bit. This is to recognize that this problem is a big, complex, planet-wide challenge. It is produced by that whole system that Lars spoke of. When people are accustomed to flying just all the time, just like, for a little weekend trip across an ocean, there are going to be two things that are going to happen. One is those people are producing huge amounts of carbon. And, there were people who were going back and forth between, I live in Connecticut. So here in the Northeast United States, in February, there were people going back and forth between Europe and Connecticut and New York and Boston. And because the virus was quite abundant in Europe by that point, and people didn't realize it, and they brought it to the Northeast United States. And so there was just sort of like, if we just sort of, I think it's sort of helping people to realize that the things we do are not, we pretend that they're frictionless and then they have no bigger costs and risks. And I think that this might help people to realize, like, oh, there are consequences to what you do. Like, just getting more and more of these consumer experiences do come with other risks and costs. And so, we need that kind of thinking for a lot of our problems. And one of those big problems is climate change. And then another one of those problems is basically like thinking about pandemics in general. We just, so I don't know. I would like to think that we will sort of have a big, broader, more global way of thinking about our problems in general, rather than retreating back into our, just overconsumption.
Sería, por tanto, dar un...
Would it be a little bit about taking a step back and realizing that in order to make progress, we need to stop exploiting wildlife and natural life, take a step back, go a little bit back to our origins, to our past, which is not so remote really, and reconnect with nature and perhaps with a simpler lifestyle. I wonder about your take on that, Lars, because in your particular connection with Buddha and with nature, you visualize and make it visible what those traditions are like and what our contact with nature is like, or should be. For some people it's kind of archaic, but it seems to be the foundation for the future now.
Well, it's fun to observe, really, because and it's quite easy to get an idea of what people return to in a situation of crisis like this, and what many people return to are the simpler crafts in life. One of the things, at least here in Norway, that has been tripled in sales is sewing machines. Because people want to do something with their hands and create something on their own. And that is not just to make time flow, but it's a certain reassurance of our own skill in caring for ourselves. So it's one of the oldest survival mechanisms, again, making clothes. You could say that it's a simple hobby and a small task, but I believe at the core of it is something much deeper. And again, if we look at what another product that was, I think the sales of it was 400%. That is yeast, because people wanted to make their own bread. And one of the things that were first sold out in the during the early weeks of the pandemic was wheat flour. Not only for if there was a breakdown, we would need something to eat, but again, it was people that wanted to take part and enjoy the old crafts. So again, very basic skills. I don't have any figures on how the urge for chopping wood and the more primal activities were. But another thing that we could measure was the sale of early potatoes, because people wanted to grow their own potatoes. And again, that's a return to the basic skills of nature. So we're looking at things that may look as a hobby, but on a deeper level is a reassurance of our skill to master the old survival crafts. So yeah, I don't believe that's a coincidence, really. We return to the crafts of the cave. Yeah.
Well, it is. This pandemic is definitely also an experiment in psychology and in human behavior, and we've had a lot of those experiences as well here in the United States. But at the same time, there's an incredible pressure of the desire to go back to normal. And it's interesting to me that like normal clearly is just a lot of consumption. So I don't know if this is much in Europe, but so a scientist I spoke to, he lives in San Francisco, and he's actually working on treatments for COVID-19. They're testing a bunch of different molecules in the hopes of finding something that's really effective against the virus. But his collaborators are in New York, and so they've been working for 6 months, like talking like us on Zoom and working on their own. And it came to the point where they really they decided they really needed to meet in person. And so he very, anxiously got on the San Francisco plane and flew to New York and worked really hard with his colleagues, and then flew home and just was hoping that he's safe, and he's not planning on flying again anytime soon. But he said the strangest thing was that when the San Francisco flight was landing in New York, they were reading off the gates for people who were going to make connections. And one of the gates was, what they said was, and for those of you on this plane who are going back to San Francisco, just, you'll need to get off the plane for a little bit so they can clean it and then get back on. The thing is that there are people who are just flying in circles because they just want to fly. They just love flying and they want to get back to it.
Really?
Yes. There's like these, and this is, I've read about this happening elsewhere, but never quite so extreme. Yes, but flying to nowhere. And I just, so I guess, I agree with you that there are some people are feeling this pull towards, kind of a more basic way of producing things that you actually do need and leaving out the things that you don't. But I think, 21st century capitalist consumption has had a really powerful grip on people's minds. And there are, lots of people who really want to get back to that hyper consumption, including getting on a plane and just flying back and forth across an entire continent. So
yeah. I believe the biggest boost that we will have when this finally is over is for the things that people miss, and that will be holidays, really. going on overseas on holidays and drinking and restaurants. And but again, one of the things that that's been criticized heavily here is that people say that, oh, this pandemic will damage the Christmas shopping, as if that was, say, a central element of our culture and seen as something, oh, that's a huge loss. We can't go Christmas shopping. So I agree with you that that urge is strong and we cannot hold it down. It will have an immediate boost when this is over.
Well, yeah, I mean, maybe there is a challenge there to find ways to lock in the lessons that people are learning, so it doesn't get wiped away.
Sí que es verdad que
Yes, it is true that right now we are in the midst of this, or in the vortex of COVID-19, so we can't evaluate the final impact and the kind of reactions by people will probably shift and change along the way. Some of them will become settled, others will go by, and for some people, when they go back to normal, they probably realize that it's not so satisfactory as they thought it was, and they may take that step back. Maybe it's soon to assess what the final impact and the real impact of COVID-19 will be on society, if we'll have changes or not. Perhaps we still need time.
Well, I know that in Spain, you are now dealing with, in Spain, you're dealing with many an increase in cases. We are too in the United States. It's a little early to talk about how this will end with much certainty. Unfortunately, I would say we are in the middle of it, and so this. But people do sometimes ask me, like, well, what do you expect? What's the future going to be like? And I think that this winter will be very challenging because certainly places like where I live, it's going to get cold enough that people aren't going to be able to go outside as much or keep their windows open. So there will be more transmission. No one will have a vaccine yet. And there will be treatments that will be pretty good, but a large number of people will unfortunately die. So this is going to be difficult, not just physically, but it's going to be a big psychological toll, and we need to find the strength to get through it. And I wish that there was something better to say, but there just isn't. In the spring, I am cautiously optimistic that there will be vaccines, but those vaccines will probably only provide 50% protection, which is much better than zero. It will bring the rate of infection down dramatically, but people will have to realize that they're not invincible. They will still have to wear masks. There will still be some social distancing, but we'll be able to do some more things that feel normal. Well, I think we will have more of that social connection that we all crave. And then, perhaps by the fall, there'll be better vaccines and, we'll be able to start to recover. But, I hope that, as we're recovering and able to do things, we will then, as part of that recovery, we say, how did this pandemic happen? And how is it connected to our other big challenges like climate change? And what kind of things can we agree to do on a large scale? So it's going to be, from October 2020 to October 2021 may be one of the most important years in modern history, I think.
Ya para ir también
Getting to the end of the session, and before times tally up, and in terms of, against the background of the connections between virus and climate change and our own relation with nature. I wonder if, because we were talking about this earlier, it was mentioned earlier, the kind of scientific explanations and the conspirational theories that circulate. I wonder if Carl Zimmer, what do you feel about these conspirational theories about people challenging or questioning science or questioning things like climate change? Why is that? How come some people, some groups try to find alternative accounts for things like COVID-19 or climate change outside science? Maybe there's a mistake there, a fault in terms of scientific pedagogy or some kind of institutional loss of prestige. Why do people go away from science and look for other explanations?
You know, I started as a science writer, writing about in the 1990s, writing a lot about evolution. And you know, in the 1990s, evolution was the topic where there was a lot of hostility towards established science. You know, we are the product of evolution, so are all other living things that are around us. And certainly in the United States, we have a very strong creationist movement. And this was before the anti-vaccine movement. This was before global warming denialism. So I feel like I kind of, I got to sort of, I got a little early practice at engaging with this issue. And, you know, I don't think that people who, creationists, if you ask a creationist, are they against science? They'll say, no, of course not. I think that I understand the real science. So, you know, you talk to someone who has a conspiracy theory of that somebody created viruses in a lab, they won't say like, oh, I don't believe in science. They'll say like, no, this is what the science says. They're wrong, but, you know, this is what the science says. You know, I think that, you know, there are certainly like, you know, things that science offers us that are very counterintuitive. You know, again, the idea, you know, the idea that we could be the product of evolution can be hard to accept. You know, we're complicated creatures. How could we have evolved? And likewise, viruses. You know, how could a virus just come that we didn't know about suddenly become a global threat? Well, someone must have done something. Again, that's a very creationist way of approaching it. Mm. And so you have these very elaborate theories of like, oh, these Chinese military scientists knew that they wanted a virus that does this and then this, and so they put this part in and this part in and this part in. What's funny is like if you talk to virologists, they'll say like, we barely understand viruses. You know, if you told me to make a virus to do a list of things, I wouldn't know how to do it. Like viruses are so sophisticated and they evolve so quickly with new adaptations that the virologists can't keep up. So, you know, I guess, you know, I don't know what a long-term solution is, but you know, if we could find ways to sort of give people a sort of an understanding of how science works and how we know what we know and so on, you know, really just starting from when children are 5 years old, I think that things would be in a better place, so that we wouldn't distract ourselves. I mean, you know, saying that this coronavirus is a conspiracy out of a lab, that's a waste of time. It's just a lot of waste of effort. You have scientists who are spending lots of time trying to debunk these myths. Like, you know, we need to be focusing on better things. The climate denialism is a huge waste of time. It's a diversion of energy. That's the point. You know, like there are people who have like set up campaigns to distract us from the real work we have to do in terms of climate change, because, you know, the more time that we don't really put in real regulations of carbon emissions, there are people who can just continue to make more money. I mean, it's you know, I hope I don't sound conspiratorial. I mean, there is evidence of these things happening. So, but it's frustrating because this kind of denying the evidence that science gives us, it wastes our time. And right now, people are dying. People are dying because people have been convinced that masks and social distancing are just a conspiracy. It's incredibly frustrating.
It's a paradox, really, because it's sort of the machine of fiction that's at work there.
Yeah.
It's one of the key motivations in this, to find an explanation on how the world is and how it's working. But
it's a better story.
It's a better story. It is really it's all the elements of, making a crime novel that's at work. But it's not fiction. It may look like fiction, but it's a lie.
No sé si un novelista se habría atrevido a fabular una historia como
I
la que
wonder if you, Lars, would have dare write a piece of fiction on a pandemic like this one. Perhaps at the beginning we might have thought that this is the subject for a novel, but it's becoming so big and it's having such a broad impact that perhaps a novelist would have been unable to imagine so much.
Now you often say that that the real life cannot match fiction. If you take some of the wildest events in history, you will often say that, well, the reader won't believe it because it's larger than life, bigger, and not something that would happen. I actually, in my latest novel that was out this autumn, I had written a long chapter from 1919 on the Spanish flu. And I had that finished when the corona hit, and I had to rewrite everything because it looked like the story was trying to mirror COVID-19 and the Spanish flu. So I reworked it and looked at and found the more surprising elements of the Spanish flu 100 years ago. Simply because the reader would be an experienced pandemic or someone with experience on pandemics. So I couldn't use the elements in the story that I first thought was surprising. I had to dig deeper into how they dealt with it in the society 100 years ago, and because it looked really like a handbook on how to avoid COVID-19, and that were the experiences 100 years ago. So yes, I had to rewrite.
Es que lo que pasó en la gripe española
Yes,
también.
Spanish flu, as many other pandemics, is something that as a society we should reread and reinterpret and reread whatever was published and written at the time, because many of the patterns that we are now realizing with COVID-19 in terms of preventive measures and social and individual measures had to be being implemented at the time to check the virus. So to some extent we're living a new situation, but perhaps not so new. We've seen similar reactions and similar developments. Okay, we've no more time. Thank you so much, the two of you, Carl Zimmer and Lars Mytting, for this inspiring conversation and interesting conversation where we've addressed COVID-19, climate change, and the environment. It was really a pleasure to have you with us here in this opening session of the 2020 Culture Forum.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Como decimos, es la jornada.
And as we were saying, this is the opening session. The event will continue from tomorrow until the 15th November. We'll go on with several other online conversations. Tomorrow we'll have ecofeminism, and there will be this talk on development and food sovereignty. So thank you again, and good evening.
Thank you very much.
Great. Okay, thanks a lot.